So should Pakistan's ministers get some media training? Well, we can offer some tips.
Reddit is called the heart of the internet, and rightly so. One of those few social media platforms today, much like Tumblr, that have still sort of held on to its sanctity in terms of the intent and the vision for creating an open social space for people to bounce off ideas, talk to one another, and just engage in whatever menial conversation that they want to make. And unlike Instagram and TikTok, which over time just became extremely forced and orchestrated, have lost their sense of candid vulnerability. And I think there just generally is a dearth of social spaces online that allow you to be yourself. I remember how 10 years ago, a toothbrush, let alone a coffee cup, would be met with conversation and engagement on Instagram. And now, unless there's like a very strategic 3x3 grid matrix method to the madness to it, it doesn't really make the cut and seems relevant, which falls extremely flat in the face of what Instagram initially set out to do, which was to create a casual, fun social space for people to just let loose and take it easy. However bleak social media might seem today, which it is, Reddit prevails as a platform that has always allowed people to be themselves, to speak their mind unabashedly, and also feel very validated, right? Because lo and behold, any bizarre, weird question, topic that you might have, you will always be met with an audience that deems it relevant and valid, and they will happily entertain it. Which is why, more than the heart of the internet, I think it makes up the underbelly. I'm a very strong proponent of Reddit when it comes to research as well, right? Because I don't think any amount of primary and secondary research can really give you the kind of insights that like a stupid subreddit can, because it just reveals so much about how people, when they're not contextualized or limited to their profile picture and their username and their performance on social media necessarily. Now, I was trying to just depict the nature of usage on different social media platforms, and the best analogy that I could like cook up was that of a keypad heat map, on which I think Reddit would have much lesser use of backspace, because people just do not hold back and people do not hesitate to voice whatever's on their mind. That being said, this sort of elusiveness, incognito, letting your guard down ecosystem that Reddit provides invites some very peculiar, although interesting discourse that we're going to get into today and unravel, including a concerning sense of parasociality with celebrities and public figures. It's almost like a virtual autopsy conducted on the things that they do and don't do, everything from wardrobe malfunctions to conspiracy theories, you name it, and it's there. Today, I'm not here to talk about an actor or an actress or an influencer, but a certain journalist who showed up on my feed and piqued my interest. And I think it should just be fair to assume that you're a celebrity in this day and age if someone's made like a fast-moving edit of, you with superimposed images and videos with a filter and a trending audio track. But yeah, I don't make the rules. Palki Sharma Upadhyay, who, if you don't know who she is a renowned public figure for her journalism and reporting in India, and she's currently the managing editor at First Post. How I heard in particular has a lot of context and baggage to it, which I will unpack in bits and pieces. But I think the interspersion of a journalist and a celebrity is pretty interesting for a country like India, given its current status. Read between the lines if you may. And this goes without saying that I'm not the first person to have conflicting feelings about journalism and just the media landscape in India. There's already enough and more discourse on the topic, and I would hate to add to the landfill. But today I want to talk about how Palki somehow has managed to completely subvert expectations from newsrooms and appeal to the Indian audience in ways we haven't seen before. But I must preface this section with the Reddit AI's description of Palki, which is just a spectacle on its own. Mind you, this description changes quite frequently as Redditors keep adding responses. So this is from back when I was doing the research for this video, so it might have changed. But anyway, this aggregate is extremely skewed and not definitive, so don't take it seriously. Palki Sharma is a prominent Indian journalist known for her strong opinions and engaging presentation style. So you can basically see there are pros and cons essentially listed down of her reporting style in this. But the main reason why I wanted to bring this up was because of good trigger discipline, which just seemed like, I don't know what cultural reference I was missing, but it just says Gotta love the trigger discipline. Like I said, it's extremely skewed, not definitive. Please don't think of this as the absolute truth. So yeah, let's head to the next most reliable AI-generated search of Palki Sharma, which is, of course, Google. Remember the days when you would go on Wikipedia, find a bajillion hyperlinks, completely submerge yourself in them, and devote yourself to the task of finding something insightful and really, really interesting. And now it's just fucking listicle that's presented to you to assume as the absolute truth. But I don't know if anybody's as bothered by it as I am. I saw a Substack post on it as well, which I resonated with a lot because I think there's just generally a dearth of curiosity right now because information is just more palatable for you right now. Anyway, she started her career at Doordarshan, moved to Hindustan Times, then CNN, then Vion, where she hosted a show called Gravitas. And it was at Vion where she sort of pivoted from and sort of exploded on mainstream social media. And apparently, she left Vion to join First Post to gain more agency over her reporting style, but that is still conjecture. Of course, this goes without saying that it's not the first time that a journalist has, made it to our feeds. I just wanted to sort of deep dive into how we interact with this content and what it reveals about the media landscape, how we perceive news, how we perceive news anchors who play an incredibly important role in how we make sense of the world and digest current affairs, right? Palki's reporting has largely been regarded really well, if it wasn't obvious already. She's been appreciated for her very no-nonsense, very tactful approach, her diction, her command over the English language, so much so that people want to learn how to speak like her. She speaks English with what is described as a neutral Indian English accent, which is technically non-native, but still polished, internationally comprehensible, and devoid of very strong regional inflections. And this places her in the mild accent category described in the study, Why Don't We Believe Non-Native Speakers, which studied the influence of accent on credibility. In this study, participants rated statements with a mild accent as just as truthful as those spoken by native speakers, while heavily accented statements were judged as less credible. Palki's diction, clarity, and neutral delivery means that her speech retains what is known as processing fluency, which makes information very easy to absorb, while also signaling a sense of credibility. In other words, her accent doesn't necessarily detract from how people receive her reporting and the nature and content of her reporting. If anything, it reinforces it even more. This isn't to say that the Indian accent is illegitimate or bad. It's just that for a country recovering from a colonial hangover, accent is a very crucial determinant of how we process information. There's an excellent piece by the Swaddle that I would recommend reading that investigates how the neutral Indian accent erases our histories, with accounts of different people across India describing their experiences of not just learning the language, but also the accent that tails it. Mahadevan25 describes how he adopted a practiced neutral English accent when he entered the workforce. It was very softly with corners smoothened. That's how most people who are deemed to be smart spoke. It's the kind of accent that implicitly signifies the caste's notion of merit as the accent of the upper classes and castes, whose accents are closest to the cultivated Indian English accent of their ancestors. The neutral Indian accent comes to represent intellect or know-how. Same way there is a sense of perceived credibility attributed to the typical British accent. In a country where English is inaccessible by and large, speaking English with an accent is an added privilege. We Indians have what The Economist calls a humble retroflex, which makes Indian English sound exclusively distinct because it's incorporated in Hindi and in regional dialects. Another interesting perspective is broached by an English professor, Vijeta Kumar. She says that learning and speaking English with an accent of one's own history becomes a form of reclaiming it and rejecting hierarchies around which language is constructed. There's power in mastering the language and wielding it like a weapon, accents and all. The reason why I brought up linguistics in the first place is because it does heavily stem from our biases of what we consider correct and incorrect information, especially because newscasters deliberately employ these strategies to land their point with more gravitas. For example, the contentious Mr. Ben Shapiro. Credits to Adam Alexic for this. Ben Shapiro is infamous for a lot of things, but most importantly for how fast he talks. This apparently is done so to counter his logical fallacies, and while there is no direct correlation between sounding intelligent and talking fast, there is a chance that you do perceive him as intelligent and therefore don't register what he does say as false. There is this sort of hyper nasality in his voice that's, conventionally attributed to that of a typical nerd, therefore can sort of very neatly package and disguise the manipulative and inflammatory things that he does say. When it comes to Palki, she has that neutral tone which is not over Americanized, so to speak. So it doesn't seem very out of touch, still seems a little relevant. Her pace is very controlled, with a very prosodic emphasis on terms such as China's aggression and India's response, which are very strategically enunciated to have an impact. And she uses a lot of framing devices such as "let's break it down" and "here's what this means" to aid her delivery and really drive home the point. This obviously is not exclusive to Palki. Almost all newscasters employ what is known as the effort code. The effort code comes from phonetics and communication studies and suggests that speakers put in extra vocal effort through articulation, pitch control, pacing, etc., for listeners to perceive the message as more credible, serious, or important. So, when a newscaster like Palki speaks, she's consciously or subconsciously applying this effort code, which is this investment of vocal effort to sound authoritative and trustworthy. Listeners then associate the effort with credibility, even if the content in itself hasn't changed. Hold on to this thought because it will be relevant soon enough. A big chunk of her admiration is also by virtue of the way in which she responds to news, which is usually in like a snappy clap back, like to the haters type of vibe. Interestingly, it's also been described as Kendrick Lamar level of hater energy. Make sense of that, what you will.
Yesterday evening, Trump posted on social media, "I don't care what India does with Russia. They can take their dead economies down together for all I care. India is the fastest growing major economy in the world. If anything's dead, it is Donald Trump's approval rating. Has landed on the moon and British influencers say, return our aid money." If you're going down that road, let's start with reparations. Let's start with the colonial loot. Return that money first. And we have the bill.
And I think there is something to be said about this approach because this is the type of content that actively makes it to our feeds and aggravates the course and opinion of the issue that is being spoken about. I do think that we've seen an uptick in news being retrofitted to suit the native TikTok vertical reel format, whether that's just for dimensions, for reach, or just the nature of the content. We don't know, but more on that later. Now, segueing to the reason why I wanted to make this video in this first place and really explore this topic was this very post. Space cards so insane, man could go to war. In fucking deed. Palki is beautiful. Okay, there's absolutely no denying. She carries herself really well. She is extremely confident, very charismatic, and there is a consensus of that on the internet, right? And people have been very unfiltered and unabashed with their declaration of love for Palki, calling her like India's new crush and chat's new mommy or whatever. While Reddit and similar forums are filled with admiration for Palki, there is a flip side where some communities do feel and argue that this sort of disproportionate craze and disproportionate focus on her looks risks trivializing her contributions as a journalist. And instead of recognizing the kind of depth she brings to her reporting, her editorial choices, or her ability to distill complex global issues into narratives that are very much more accessible, it sometimes reduces her presence to the superficial. This creates a subtle double bind, right? Because on one hand, her very polished presentation enhances her credibility and audience appeal. On the other hand, over-indexing on her appearance can undermine her stature by implying that her success is rooted more in style than in substance. And for a journalist who has built a career on very incisive analysis and clarity, being constantly reframed through the lens of looks can feel reductive. In fact, in conversation with Palki and journalist Smita Prakash, they broached the topic of how there's like a very unhealthy fixation with women and their appearances and how the content gets completely overlooked in the process. This is a topic that Palki has actively spoken about. I'll leave a link in the description box if you want to check it out. In essence, these Reddit criticisms, and just the duality, sort of highlights a cultural tension whether news anchors are valued more as communicators of information or as on-screen personalities whose appearance shapes audience perception. And for Palki, this conversation reveals how women in media are often subjected to a narrower spectrum of recognition where their work risks being secondary to how they are seen. Keeping all of this in our mental reservoir of information we didn't know we needed, I wanted to dissect what it's like for a news anchor to receive such celebrity status, right? But before that, I want to introduce a concept that I love and revere a lot, which is Medium is the Message by Marshall McLuhan, who's a philosopher of communication theory. He is excellent and I am a fan. Medium is the Message essentially states that what has been communicated has always been less important than how it has been communicated. Essentially, the medium in which it has been communicated, which is not merely just a function of speech, print, and videos, but also the format in which the information is presented, outweighs the content altogether. And I would argue that a huge chunk of Gen Z's inclination for Palki stems from the bite-sized reels and short-form content with bedazzled edits. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with her, but it is important for us to acknowledge that a message aggregator and conveyor does aid to our confirmation bias. This was a whole lot of English just to say that we will be more inclined to believe things and topics that aid to our existing thoughts and opinions when it's presented by someone we look up to, a fangirl, which I think begs the question of credibility and whether it can get diluted or heightened in this equation, since news by default is more often than not sensationalized and blown out of proportion. And when you add influence into this mix, you erode objectivity to a certain extent. This leads to a much larger dilemma. Does your personal brand begin to overshadow journalism and your reportage? Or do people tune in for news and information and current affairs, or do they tune in for you? Look at this post where someone equates Palki to the Pied Piper in defining her impact and community of loyalists. This is no outlier because Palki Sharma's show Vantage gave First Post YouTube channel a major boost. Subscribers surged from 219K in January to 1 million by April, marking an impressive 356.6% growth. I wanted to draw a parallel between this celebrity stature and another news anchor who I deeply respect and adore, Faye D'Souza, who in an interview with Tweak India said that she quit her high-paying job at a top news channel to go solo, creating a model that's never been done before in India. She's the voice of reason that we've all come to rely on for our daily news updates. And like a true icon, she downplays her groundbreaking work with a simple, I want to be remembered as one of the good ones, someone who tried to do the right thing. Faye is known for her bite-sized digestible content format, which is a great way to interrupt a feed of brain rot and take out some time to get up to date on current affairs. Even made it to Grazia's Cool List digital cover in 2021. And while I am really fond of her, she has been given flack for headlines that are typically rage baity or don't necessarily warrant the attention and reaction that they do. And she has been accused of being a little selective about the news that she picks. But again, I have to give credit to her format and thoughtful distribution of information. The reason why I chose news anchors is because they're critical to our sense-making of the world, and Gen Zs are a fascinating case of consumers redefining who gets to and is allowed to be the person in charge. Reed Littman, the global consulting director at Ogilvy, wrote a very, very interesting post on how news is a matter of taste for Gen Z. He describes how Gen Z has come of age in a cascading polycrisis of pandemics, violence, climate anxiety, and economic turmoil, and that these events have shaped their search for truth and who gets to be the bearer of this news. He then goes on to state that the shift is structural today, and how 44% say that social video is their main news source, with TikTok at number 1, and are twice as likely to get news from social as from TV, and often say the news finds me instead of me finding news, which rewrites this narrative of how authority flows from institutions down to creators sideways. In fact, traditional news networks are also trying to adapt to this, with CNN, Fox, The Atlantic, and even The Economist now experimenting with TikTok native formats. The flow of information and the format it gets shared in is one of Gen Z's only source of power. In fact, 91% of Gen Z in India rely on social media platforms for news. According to a Google Kantar study, they seek news that is trustworthy, emotionally resonant, and visually compelling. Generative AI tools enable them to interpret, simplify, and verify information very quickly. The future of news isn't about who breaks the story first, but who earns the right to tell it in a format that Gen Z deems worthy of attention. And I wanted to end this section of the video on consumption by bridging what Roland Barthes in his seminal 1967 essay, The Death of the Author, presented, and an idea very similar to what Marshall McLuhan stated on the state of consumption today, where they decenter the traditional idea of content being a fixed author-driven message. Barthes says, don't look to the author for meaning, it comes alive in the reader. And McLuhan said, don't look at the content, the medium itself is shaping the meaning. So, be wise, make sense of what you will, and consume mindfully, especially what needs to be consumed mindfully.